Well, thank you, gentlemen, for having me here tonight. As you know, I hope you know, tonight is a historic night for both of our organizations. While we have had some passing level of communication throughout the years, the sitting president of Sigma Pi Fraternity International, it's what we call our Grand Sage, it's the position I hold, has never visited Beecher Hall to deliver a speech in front of the assembled Sigma Pi Literary Society. So I thank you for granting me that privilege, and I hope that my comments tonight are helpful to each of you individually and to the society overall. While we were at lunch today, I learned that some of the society's members were not really aware of the relationship between our two organizations, or rather, why Sigma Pi Fraternity is called Sigma Pi at all. So I'd like to start tonight by going over the history of our two organizations as they relate to one another. The society's story starts back in 1843, which of course you all know. The fraternity's story begins a little while after then and includes one of the society's most famous members, William Jennings Bryan. The main character in the story is a gentleman named Robert George Patterson, who was born in 1885 in Ohio. When Patterson was just 10 years old, he heard Bryan speak for the first time, and he was enthralled by what he heard. For those of you who don't know what Bryan's speaking style was like, think about the current president of the United States and the rallies that he holds. Typically, you'll see people at these rallies get all whipped up into a frenzy, right? Politicians who engage in that type of discourse were once called populists because they speak directly to people's experiences. Bryan was among the first populists in the United States, and that was the type of speech that Patterson heard when he was 10 years old. After he heard Bryan speak, Patterson was hooked. He began a scrapbook that chronicled the travels and the speeches that Bryan was giving all around the country. Today, I guess we might like a politician on Facebook or you might follow them on Instagram. Back in the late 1800s, you started a scrapbook. So that's what Patterson did. In fact, he was so obsessed with Bryan that he began researching where he went to school, what he studied, which groups he joined, and that's where Patterson learned of a group called the Sigma Pi Literary Society right here at Illinois College. If Patterson was going to follow in the footsteps of Bryan, then he knew he had to become a member of Sigma Pi. So we'll jump ahead to 1905. Patterson's 19 years old. He visits Illinois College without his parents' knowledge. He snuck away on a train to Jacksonville, and he arrived on campus during the summer months when class was not in session. He made his way around campus, and he met a kindly janitor named Henry W. Franz. Together, they walked to Beecher Hall, and Patterson came up here to the second floor and stood right here in this very spot where I'm standing now. And with just the janitor, just Franz watching him, he recited one of Bryan's famous speeches from memory. So he stood right here, and he recited the Cross of Gold speech that Bryan gave at the 1896 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. You guys familiar with that speech? So the Cross of Gold speech is considered one of the greatest American political speeches of all time. Bryan won the nomination to become the Democratic candidate for president because of the speech. He won it there at the convention because of the speech. In the speech, he's talking about rejecting the gold standard for the nation's monetary policy, and he ended the speech by saying, and this is where the name of the speech comes from, he said, "Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests and the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down on the brow of labor this cross of thorns. You should not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." And I have to admit that standing in this hall where Bryan perfected his speaking skills and where Patterson recited those very same words, it's a pretty special moment for me. So thank you again for giving me this opportunity tonight. So Patterson was in this room, and he spoke those very words in this room, not to a group of 20 or 25 guys like we have here tonight, but to just the janitor. And the janitor was impressed, and he encouraged Patterson. He said, "Patterson, you should enroll at Illinois College. You should join Sigma Pi Society." So Patterson made his way back home, and he found out that his parents, who were friendly with the president of Ohio State University, had already enrolled him at Ohio State for the coming fall semester. Now, if you're Patterson and you want to be a member of Sigma Pi Society, what do? Well, Patterson was offered to join 2 or 3 different fraternities at Ohio State. He rejected all of the offers because none of them were Sigma Pi. He did, however, send a letter here to the society, hoping they would expand, hoping they would start a new chapter at Ohio State, and then grow the society at campuses across the country. And the society wasn't interested. They didn't want to expand, but Patterson was undeterred. He then found another Sigma Pi society up in Toronto. So he reached out to them with the same offer, expand to Ohio State, and let's go across the country. And the Canadians said no to. So at this point, Patterson had spent about a year trying to get Sigma Pi to come to his campus, and he was rejected the entire way. Most people in Patterson's position would give up hope, and he would never become a member of Sigma Pi, move on to a different group, but not Patterson. Instead of giving up, he created a fantastical story about an organization known as Sigma Pi Fraternity, not Sigma Pi Literary Society. He created a whole history for the organization, saying it started in 1752 at the College of William and Mary, that it grew into this large fraternity at campuses across the country before it became inactive during the Revolutionary War. Believable story. He then claimed that in 1801, the fraternity started again, but it started as a father-son style organization, where membership was conferred to new members by virtue of your father being a member. And he suggested that that's how the fraternity operated for more than 100 years. So in the summer of 1906, Patterson was spending some time visiting his family in Indiana again, stopped in at the local library. He saw a young woman, started chatting with her. She was working at the library, and he learned that she recently graduated from this small school in Indiana called Vincennes. So in his chatting with the young woman, she mentioned that there was an excellent local fraternity at Vincennes, and that fact stuck in Patterson's head. So later that year, December 1906, Patterson sent a letter addressed to, and I quote, the president of the Men's Greek Letter Fraternity at Vincennes University. He wrote the letter on official letterhead, and he signed it as the National Secretary of Sigma Pi Fraternity, a position that did not exist for an organization that did not exist. In his letter, he asked the local fraternity, which was named Tau Phi Delta, to consolidate with us and take our name and become one of our chapters. Well, Patterson's efforts finally hit fertile ground, and Tau Phi Delta agreed to become the alpha chapter of this revived version of Sigma Pi Fraternity. On February 11th, 1907, Tau Phi Delta voted to change their name to Sigma Pi Fraternity, and they wanted to take on the mantle of being the fraternity's alpha chapter. 1 year later, Patterson sent a letter to the alpha chapter telling them he had now been elevated to the position of national president, another position that didn't exist. In that letter, he claimed that Brian was a member of the fraternity because, you see, if the society would not expand to allow Patterson to become a member, then after borrowing the society's name, Patterson was also going to borrow some prestigious alumni names to help grow his new fraternity. And it worked for a time. In May 1908, the fraternity took over a local organization at the University of Illinois, and that became our Phi chapter. Also in May 1908, the fraternity absorbed Phi Kappa Phi at Ohio State University. They became our Gamma chapter. And so the fraternity began to grow primarily here in the Midwest, and primarily through the efforts of Tau Phi Delta members, not Patterson. But things, of course, could not progress this way forever. Just 1 year later, in February 1909, people in the Greek world began to question this story of Sigma Pi fraternity. But Patterson stuck to his guns. He began writing letters to the naysayers and publishing op-eds in the name of the fraternity, defending his history that dated back to 1752. But what really brought down Patterson's house of cards was when the fraternity tried to connect with Brian. They tried to invite him to attend some events at different chapters. And Brian responded in his letters, making it clear that he wished the fraternity well, but he was a member of Sigma Pi Literary Society, not the fraternity. And that's about it for Patterson in Sigma Pi. In November 1909, an undergraduate named Willard M. Kiplinger, you may know Kiplinger from the financial markets, one of our alumni, he moved to have a committee appointed to investigate Patterson and this story that he created. So an investigation took place. Patterson was found to have made up the entire history of Sigma Pi fraternity, and a trial was held to determine his fate. Patterson didn't attend the trial, but he did quietly resign his membership in Sigma Pi fraternity. And that's how Sigma Pi fraternity came to use the same name as Sigma Pi Literary Society. Although a little bit more history for you. Some years later, in 1922, someone calling themselves the president of Sigma Pi fraternity at Vincennes University, this is 1922, our chapter at Vincennes closed in 1910. So 12 years after they closed, someone calling themselves the president of that chapter sent a letter to the society informing them that the society was using the fraternity's name and that since the fraternity could trace its history all the way back to 1897, the society would be hearing from our attorney. So the society got a kick out of that and responded that they've been using the name Sigma Pi since 1843, and the fraternity would be hearing from their attorney. No one on either side ever heard from any attorney. It's mostly just posturing by fraternity men. Then in 1929, the society had one of its topics for discussion, whether it would be advisable to join the National Sigma Pi fraternity. I know you have topics each semester or each year, and that was one of the topics in 1929. This came up for debate again here at the society in the 1940s, but there was no communication with the fraternity. However, in 1959, the society wrote to the fraternity asking for more information about becoming part of the national organization. In 1960, the fraternity sent members of our organization here at Illinois College to meet with the society and to meet with the campus administrators. The representatives were very impressed with the members of the society, but they found that the college administrators were not interested in having national groups come on campus. A few months later, in 1960, the society wrote another letter to the fraternity saying, and I quote, "We are very interested, to say the least, in becoming a member of the Sigma Pi fraternity." Our records don't show that there was ever a response provided back to the society, but we do show that in 1968, the society reached out again saying, and I quote, "We wish to keep the communication lines open. We are hopeful that more contact can be made. One of the things we want to know is what are the advantages for us if we go national." We don't show an official response to that letter either. But we do show that later in 1968, one of our prominent alumni, Judge Curtis Shake, whose son was a student at Illinois College and joined Sigma Pi Society while he was a student here, Judge Shake prepared what is known as a proposal for a compact of union and progress between the society and the fraternity. He delivered the message to the society in August of 1968. The society called together a special meeting of its undergraduates and its prominent alumni. Together, the undergraduates and the alumni decided that this was a decision for the undergraduates to make, and the undergraduates in December 1968 wrote back to Judge Shake, saying in part that they were honored by the proposal, but, and I quote, "We noted that many times in the past, similar proposals of compacts were vetoed by the SIGs of Illinois College. Discussion has now ceased in our hall about the proposed compact, and I must report that the consensus of our group holds a negative attitude towards the proposed compact." Judge Shake and the fraternity understood the message, we got it, but the judge did take issue with the idea that the society had vetoed similar proposals in the past. He wrote back thanking the society for its consideration, but noting that he had seen numerous letters from the society asking if the fraternity would entertain some sort of union, and that was why he reached out in the first place. The interaction between the judge and society ended with both agreeing, "May Sigma Pi live forever." And I think that all of us in this room right now would probably agree with that statement. In December 1971, the society made Judge Shake an honorary member, and aside from a brief visit by our executive director in the 1980s, as well as some brief interactions here and there, the society and the fraternity have not had any official, formal relationship or interactions until today. And as I said earlier tonight, we're making history, and this is important for the fraternity, and I hope it's as important to the society as it is to us too. The fraternity would not hold the name Sigma Pi today if not for the oratory presence of your member, William Jennings Bryan. The powerful speeches that Bryan perfected in this hall are what inspired Patterson to convince Tau Phi Delta to call themselves Sigma Pi. That is the bond that ties our two organizations together, and that bond is important. We need to do all that we can to recognize and honor that bond.